In the depths of the night, it was clear. She'd have to face this alone. Darcy tried to trace her thoughts back, to locate the origins of all this. When did this feeling that was so unexplainable, so otherworldly, settle within her? It put a weight in her core, extending outward, becoming her. There was so much more to Darcy than anyone cared to search for. She understood emotions with an all-consuming empathy. And with each place she went, she felt herself fade away, becoming absorbed. Why this, and why her? It was a question with no simple answer, yet Darcy felt like an answer most obvious was right there within her, right where she was most scared to look. Welcome to Mirrors, a collection of horrors, history, and hauntings. I'm your host, Gabby, and today I'm in Philadelphia, heading to one of the most infamous abandoned locations in the world. Eastern State Penitentiary consists of a central octagon-shaped rotunda with cell blocks extending outward. Visiting Eastern State today, voices easily carry down the long hallways and through the cells. There have been numerous reports of disembodied voices and tortured screams, as well as the slamming of cell doors. These echoes are residual. I can imagine the inmates heard cries of pain from people whose faces they never saw. However, considering inmates were often punished for speaking, most moments were likely spent in silence. A gruesome story from the prison centers around a man named Matthias Macumsey, who tried talking with the inmate in the cell next to him. Considering this was strictly prohibited, Matthias was put into an iron gag, which went over his tongue and kept him from speaking or moving his mouth at all. The gag was then attached to his arms, which were pinned behind his back. He was later found dead, his tongue ripped from his body. This was shortly after Eastern State opened, and it caused quite the scandal, leading to a long investigation into the prison. The administrators were eventually exonerated, and Eastern State lived on. That trauma, though, never went away. And this story stands as a persistent reminder. Here, solitude was the weapon, the ultimate form of torture. I'm walking through cell block 7, down a hallway of cells, and you can stop and look into each one. See the bed, drawers. Everything is in ruins, and the paint's chipping off the walls. The furniture's covered in dust. Eastern State was the world's first true penitentiary. The founders thought that leaving someone alone with their thoughts would make them feel regret. It was a concept that grew out of Enlightenment ideas, first imagined amongst a group of thought leaders in the home of Benjamin Franklin. These individuals wanted to not only reform the prison system, but set a new international standard. It took 30 years for these ideas to turn into action, with Eastern State Penitentiary opening in 1829. Over 300 prisons around the world followed suit, employing the same physical design and practices. We're outside cell block 6 now. This one is gated off. You can't walk down, and I think just to look down the hallway and see everything as it is untouched. It really holds the weight of everything that's happened here. The penitentiary was founded on the basis of a Quaker-inspired system called solitary confinement. Each inmate had their own cell with a single skylight, representing God's light. It was intended to inspire religious salvation. In addition to not being able to communicate with others in prison, inmates were not able to have visitors, receive letters from home, or have any form of contact with the outside world. They couldn't even read any books other than the Bible. They were truly alone in every way imaginable, often driven to madness. There's a few cells that you are able to actually go into. I'm standing under one of the skylights and just thinking, like, that's all the person that was in here could see of the world beyond this place. Being in a place like this where there were so many different people here for different reasons with different experiences that endured different traumas here, I try to take moments to just really think of like individual people. It's really, definitely creates this heavy environment. There were murderers, rapists, and other objectively awful people imprisoned at Eastern State Penitentiary. However, that wasn't always the case. Men, women, and children were imprisoned alongside one another, no matter their crime and its severity. In looking back on the history, it's clear now that many of the people there didn't even deserve to be there. I just walked past a sign talking about different reasons why people were imprisoned here. It lists the production and sale of alcohol, abortion, sodomy, and vagrancy, which is the state of being homeless or unemployed. There was even a dog named Pep. Yes, a literal dog who was arrested for killing the governor's cat. Pep lived at Eastern State for 2 years before being moved to the farm branch outside of Philly. If you don't believe me, you can look up Pep's mugshot and prisoner number. Eastern State is also infamous for the hoods the inmates had to wear, which is a haunting image in itself. These hoods were worn by prisoners when being transported through common spaces to prevent interactions with others or knowledge of their surroundings. So we're at the solitary exercise yard. Each inmate was allowed to come outside of their cell and be out in the fresh air for 30 minutes a day, but they were still alone in a cell when doing that. And I'm actually standing in one of these solitary exercise yards right now. It's hard to imagine, like, being so isolated in everything that you do in every part of your day. Although controversial, Eastern State and the Pennsylvania system of solitary confinement inspired curiosity and even admiration. It drew famous people such as British author Charles Dickens to visit. He was initially intrigued by the penitentiary as an architectural wonder. After visiting, though, he ended up being a staunch critic of Eastern State and its ways. He wrote in American Notes for General Circulation, "I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. And because its ghastly signs and tokens are not so palpable to the eye, and it extorts few cries that human ears can hear, therefore I the more denounce it, as a secret punishment in which slumbering humanity is not roused up to stay." Charles Dickens' fame gave his thoughts a platform, but he was just one of many people questioning the ethics and effectiveness of solitary confinement. This was a place that was drawing the attention of the entire world, especially with so many other institutions following its example. Yet only those who stepped through the gates were truly aware of the horrors within. Even then, only those subject to solitary confinement, as well as the other torturous punishments that followed, could understand the deep emotional, physical, and spiritual impact Eastern State Penitentiary had. Countless inmates were driven to insanity, and many took their own lives. Throughout its history, at least 2 guards and numerous inmates were murdered, and hundreds died from disease and old age. By the 1970s, Eastern State realized how unrealistic solitary confinement was. It eventually just became way too crowded to stick to the system it was founded on, and solitary confinement was officially abandoned in 1913. In the following years, group dining halls were introduced. The number of prisoners continued growing to over 6 times the original capacity, and numerous riots broke out. And with the absence of solitude, the prison adopted new forms of punishment. There was the water bath. Inmates would be dunked in freezing cold water and then hung on a wall overnight. This was especially popular in the winter, when its effects would be most painful. And then there was the mad chair, where prisoners would be strapped tightly to an old barber chair, so tightly it would hinder proper blood circulation. They'd then be left, trapped, and starving for days on end. During the 1920s and 30s, Eastern State was under control of a warden named Herbert Smith, known as Herbert Hardboiled Smith. He was infamous for his disturbing forms of punishment. And it's said during his time there, the state only sent prisoners there who they felt needed his cruel ways to experience a dramatic transformation. I'm looking at the mad chair right now and just have a physical object. I think, in this exploration of learning about the paranormal and visiting haunted places, it's interesting to be in a place like Eastern State and having these different, spaces in front of your eyes, and then to see something like this where people were tortured and left here to starve. It's really hard to imagine. Many notable people were imprisoned at Eastern State throughout its history. Remember Jenny Wade from episode 3? Her father was a raging alcoholic who was in and out of prison constantly. He was incarcerated at Eastern State for 2 years after being found guilty of theft. His time in solitary confinement is credited for fueling his mental instability. Apparently, he was never truly aware that Jenny had died after being shot during the Battle of Gettysburg. It was just a concept that he couldn't grasp, which could be a reason his soul is so restless in the Jenny Wade house today. And of course, we can't forget notorious gangster Al Capone. He was arrested outside a Philadelphia movie theater in 1929 for carrying a concealed, unlicensed weapon. Despite everything he'd done prior, this was Capone's first time in prison. He served for 8 months before being released on good behavior and lived in the nicest cell Eastern State had to offer, with fine furniture, antiques, paintings, and a radio. The guards and officials were also reportedly very nice to him. I'm at Al Capone's cell. You can hear the music. It's very nice and decorated in there. Definitely doesn't look like the rest of the prison. Today, you can stand outside of his cell, admiring it as it would have been during his time there. However, I'm sure it is lesser known that Al Capone himself claimed to have been haunted at Eastern State, which may just be the first documented haunting in the building. He was driven to near insanity by a ghost named Jimmy, and he'd scream for Jimmy to leave him alone in the middle of the night. Eastern State Penitentiary saw Al Capone, a violent, infamous gangster, transformed into a weeping and terrified mess, according to officials. Jimmy is believed to be the spirit of James Clark, one of his victims during the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Al Capone, like I said, was eventually released on good behavior, although his haunting was said to continue, following him throughout his time at Alcatraz and up until the moment of his death. There's even rumors that Capone hired a medium at a point in time to help him. This could all be attributed to hallucinations caused by syphilis, which Capone contracted and left untreated for far too long. Because of this, he had severe neurological effects and other complications throughout his body. He eventually died in 1947 at the age of 48. There are other notable people whose names are known because of their attempted escapes. In 1832, prisoner William Hamilton tried to escape. He had worked as a waiter to the warden, which likely gave him a better idea than other inmates how the penitentiary was set up. He was able to climb down the front of the building from the roof. There was another escape attempt in 1945, when infamous bank robber Slick Willie Sutton, along with masonry repair worker Clarence Kleindienst, and 10 other inmates dug a tunnel almost 100 feet underground from cell 68. Willie Sutton, upon his arrest, was on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He took full credit for the escape plan. He and the other inmates had worked in shifts to dig. They'd hide the dirt in their pockets and put it in the yard during their outdoor time. Their escape was successful for a few minutes. They got a short taste of freedom before being recaptured and brought back into Eastern State Penitentiary. In Where the Money Was, Sutton recalled coming face to face with two policemen during their escape. They tried to shoot, and he dared them to do so. I snarled at them, and at that moment I honestly hoped he would. Then I wheeled and began to run. He emptied his gun at me, but I wasn't hit, he said. However, in his efforts to evade being shot, he tripped and fell, giving the police time to catch him. Throughout its history, there were over 100 documented escape attempts, with 59 people who were actually able to get outside. However, it was very rare that an escape attempt was truly successful. For years, only one man was credited with escaping and avoiding recapture. In 1923, Leo Callahan scaled the east wall via a ladder, along with 5 other inmates. They subdued 2 guards on the way, and they were able to make it out. All of his accomplices were found, but Callahan's fate remains a mystery. According to Eastern State's official website, they've identified 3 other men who were able to evade recapture as well: Bernard Tease, Patrick Lafferty, and Timothy Boyle. The penitentiary continues to do research, hoping to further develop its archives and uncover any unknown stories. Eastern State was closed in 1971 and was left abandoned. Philadelphia bought it in 1980 with commercial development in mind. However, the focus eventually shifted to restoration and preservation.
One thing that's really interesting about Eastern State is how much they've done to honor the history and make exhibits about the people that were here. So there's so many photographs around, and I think that I don't know, I mean, I love taking pictures, and I think it's a beautiful way to capture a moment, but then to see photos from the history is really, really cool. Right now we're looking at one from 1960 with inmates and guards celebrating Christmas together. There's a big tree in the middle of them. Just really cool to see the people here.
Today, Eastern State Penitentiary hosts history tours, artist exhibitions, site rentals for events and film production, and an annual Halloween Nights festival. The penitentiary states that their goal is to become the national leader in criminal justice education. As a part of its educational programs, Eastern State has highlighted individuals who faced clear and heartbreaking injustices within its walls. In 1881, Isaac Hall, who was known in their community as Lady Washington, was sentenced to 8 years in prison for having consensual sex with a man. There are many stories similar to this one, which goes to show that innocent people were punished solely for their identity. Racial minorities were imprisoned at higher rates than white people, especially amongst the youth incarcerated at Eastern State. Historian Jen Mannion spoke about solitary confinement and its racist roots, saying, "This was very much a system designed for controlling Black people and people who were fighting for freedom." Prejudice was a devastating part of the penitentiary's founding and existence, and that prejudice still exists in today's prison system. That's the main reason that Eastern State today is so devoted to learning about those who were in prison there, and are placing those stories at the center of their educational and advocacy efforts. I do want to note that a statement was released within the last few years saying that Eastern State does not allow paranormal investigations or the use of any paranormal equipment on the property. They say they are solely focused on their mission to expand educational programs on criminal justice reform, which I totally understand and respect. That being said, I strongly believe the paranormal can be a way to learn about and honor history. So I still wanted to do an episode about Eastern State and document my own experiences and observations in the space. And this is one of those places where you don't need to go looking for ghosts. The energy is incredibly concentrated, and many have had totally unexpected paranormal experiences here throughout the years. It's been featured on shows like Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures. Zach Baggins even said it's easily one of the most haunted places he's ever been. From the surrounding streets, a man has been spotted in the guard tower, even though the stairs have crumbled and it's virtually impossible to get up there. Employees have named a female spirit the Soap Lady after spotting her frequently sitting in the last cell on the second floor, which was at one point used as the women's ward. She's always dressed in white. And that's just one of the many spirits employees have encountered. Perhaps working there, they're more likely to experience something paranormal because they're in the building for long hours, consistently over time. Some are also there after hours when there are few, if any, other people present. Gary Johnson, who used to work as a locksmith at Eastern State, said he was once removing a lock in cell block 4. He reported feeling like someone was watching him. He looked down the empty cell block to find no one. He looked away, then looked back. Just then, a shadow jumped across the block, between cells. According to thoughtcatalog.com, Gary has also seen the faces of tortured souls suddenly appear on cell walls. And then there's those disembodied noises, cell doors slamming, unexplained footsteps, and the voices. Visitors and employees alike have heard screams, crying, talking, or even sadistic laughter. With the trauma, violence, and anguish experienced within Eastern State fueling its hauntings, it's no surprise that the cell block of death row has been placed at the center of many of these supposed encounters. Here, shadowy figures have been seen, and an overwhelming presence has been felt.
The first time I visited Eastern State, I remember walking down cell block 2. We weren't listening to the audio tour or following the map or anything. We were just walking around. And I got this really strong feeling that I was going to cry. We stepped outside and I turned to my friend and she said, I feel like I'm going to cry. Like we both felt the same thing at the same moment in the same spot. And it turns out that we were right outside death row. And so I, count that as a paranormal experience I've had here because I just felt this emotion that wasn't mine, and then learning where we were.
Eastern State Penitentiary, like the other locations we visited, has a heaviness to the air that is indescribable. Its history and the intricacies of each inmate's stories and experiences has left the sense that so much more lies in the silence. That brings us to the end of this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Check in next Tuesday for more haunting tales. Until then, stay spooky. This has been Mirrors, Horrors, History, and Hauntings, produced and hosted by Gabby Fry.